Hi, it's my turn, it's my turn. Yeah, so I've been doing research for the last couple of years about musicians and their relationships with the audience, which I'll talk about in a minute, why anybody ought to care, even if you don't care about music. But that's what I want to talk about. So why musicians is sort of the obvious question, and what do musicians have to do with national priorities? Aside from the fact that most candidates are using music in their campaigns and getting in trouble because it turns out Rage Against the Machine were in fact raging against Paul Ryan. Musicians are a really interesting case because what musicians are experiencing is really at the cutting edge, I would argue, of what almost all of us who present ourselves in social media are experiencing, including public figures, political figures. I think some of the issues that came up this morning around politicians' use of the web, government organizations' use of the web, a lot of those things that they're encountering are things that musicians have been wrestling with for years. And part of this has to do with the fact that the file size of songs is so small that there's really not much reason to buy music anymore unless you actually care. So that's part of it. So there's a number of practical things that play out here. There's a number of theoretical things that I'll orient you to a bit. But what I really want to focus on mostly is my methods and the messiness of trying to work through this kind of data. And then, time permitting, I'll show you just a little bit of what an analysis out of this looks like, might look like. So some of the practical concerns, and I'll talk about these somewhat more. It used to be, and this is true of all public figures, that there were some pretty clear intermediaries between their voices and the voices of the people, right? You had the media, and that was the job of the media. It was to, or part of the job of the media was to filter what politicians said, what musicians said, what movie stars said, what CEOs said. They were there. There was this filter in between. That meant that if you wanted an audience, you had to get the media, first of all, which has been completely disrupted. But it also meant that you didn't have to actually communicate with your audience very much, or with your constituents, or whatever. And now you do. And I want to argue that that has some pretty profound changes at all kinds of levels. You've got all kinds of industries being profoundly decentralized. And again, you see this very clearly in the music industry, where suddenly people are doing things in all kinds of alternative ways, and the major labels don't know what to do. But you also see this in the rise of citizen activism and the ways in which people are organizing outside of official organizations in order to enact change. You have a lot of moving away from big centers of power. And I don't want to be utopian about that and say, woohoo, hierarchy's dead, because those centers of power are fighting back something fearsome and really working to consolidate power in the face of this. This is a really serious threat, and they know it, and they're fighting it. Just look at SOPA and PIPA. What interests me that's going on here most, because I come out of interpersonal communication way back when, is that this is not just about these large things like markets and economies and governments and so on. It's also at a very personal level about the relationships that we have with one another and what this kind of direct interaction does to those relationships, which is, of course, something about which there's a tremendous amount of fear, a tremendous amount of anxiety. If you think about the outcry about bloggers aren't real journalists, they don't fact check, right? Well, guess what? Neither does Newsweek. Nobody really knows what to do. Nobody's got a roadmap. Nobody's got a plan. Here's how you do it. And there's just a tremendous amount of fear going on. And even when people aren't afraid, even when they embrace it, there's a lot of anxiety because people don't know what it is that they're supposed to do. These are just a couple of pictures of what's happened to the recording industry. The lower one is the Recording Industry Association of America. The higher one is the European equivalent. I love that the RIAA's profit map starts in 1999, which is the peak of that upper one. I'll leave you clever people to interpret the rhetoric of that for yourself. So you have a lot of what have been very mainstream pillars of the economy in decline. But at the same time, you have this incredible proliferation of other companies, right? So this is a thing that somebody did in 2007 of Web 2.0, Music 2.0 companies. An awful lot of them don't exist anymore, but other ones have taken their place. So you have a real redistribution of labor and organizations happening. And then you also have fan funding, which is this really interesting phenomenon where you're bypassing the middle ground altogether. And I've noticed just in the last week, more and more fan funding of academia going on. There was a note on the Association of Internet Researchers mailing list this morning where they're doing fan funding to translate a book that's been published in German into English so that they can distribute it internationally. Amanda Palmer just had one of the most successful projects yet. A musician, she sought $200,000 and had 45 days to do it. She raised $400,000 in 48 hours and ended up raising over $1.2 million by the time her deadline expired. Kickstarter put $28 million into the American music industry last year at a time when the labels are saying people won't pay for music anymore, right? There's $28 million people chose to pay. Well, why? Why would you do that? Why would you actively give money to something that you don't have to, right? Because you can just download it when it comes out, right? Or you can probably find a torrent of it even before it has. I would argue one of the big reasons people care enough to give is that there's relational issues here, that people have formed a sense of relationship with people and they feel obligated, they feel obliged. Gift economies 101. Here's a quote from one of the people I interviewed, Mark Kelly from a band Marillion, who were one of the first to use fan funding. And I think this quote really exemplifies the kind of concern, right? It used to be that rock stars just dropped out of the sky, and now we're tweeting about what we had for breakfast. People are still trying to find out where to draw the boundaries and what works and what doesn't, you know. And this is true of musicians, but it's true of, you know, raise the hand if you've figured out the boundaries and what works and what doesn't, because, you know, more power to you. This has not stopped a whole lot of people from being very prescriptive about what you should be doing, and sometimes offering good advice. This is Ariel Hyatt's social media pyramid in giving advice on what posts people should do. So direct engagement is like bread, cereal, and pasta. You should do 3 to 4 out of every 10 posts should be this. And then up there at the top, you have self-promotion, which is equivalent to fats, oils, and sweets. And you should only 1 out of every 10 posts should be self-promotion. It's not bad advice. It's good advice. And you know, I think she's genuinely trying to help people who are confused. But it speaks to the ways in which people are just making this stuff up, right? Again, I think it's perfectly good advice. I think if you follow it, nothing bad is going to happen, and it might make you feel a lot better. But there's a lot of advice being given to people in public positions, tweeting, using social media in public positions, and we don't really know what works and what doesn't in any sector.
Ines Merkel could use this.
Yeah, she's stepped out. Well, she'll find it on the internet. Okay, some of the theoretical perspectives that drive me, and one could come at this with a huge variety, but these are some of the ones that drive me. One of my overarching arguments, one of the things that I am particularly interested by, is this idea that what were seemingly pretty pure economic markets, where there was a product and you bought the product. Now, music was never quite that simple, right? Because you always put posters on them on your wall because you loved them so much. But it was a pretty clear commercial transaction, and more it's relational, right? So the relational and the social and the economic are really merging in new ways that I think have really profound implications for everything. And there's this long-standing tradition of research in gift economies, these questions of giving without money, non-commercial transactions, and how those relationships are structured, how the norms work in those kinds of exchanges. Oddly, social exchange theory and gift economy theory have not really talked to one another very much. They really should, because they're talking about the exact same stuff. Issues of identity management. How do you present yourself in these public platforms when there's all kinds of viewers? The phrase collapsed context has come up and will come up again. Also issues of relational negotiation. I am particularly fond of Baxter and Montgomery's work on relational dialectics, which argues that often relationships are conceived of as moving in stages. And their argument is that we're always balancing opposing tensions, right? That there's always, and if we think about this in social media, public, private, present, absent, these are really core dialectics that people have to manage in relating to others. And then finally, we can think about something that has always driven my work, what's causing what happens here. And of course, you have the technological determinism, which I think most of us are kind of, I heard somebody say, not to sound too much like a technological determinist, right? We know we have to apologize if we start sounding deterministic. I would place myself somewhere in the middle in that I don't think technology are sole causes by any stretch, but I think that we're kind of deluding ourselves if we think they don't influence us at all, that design does matter, that interfaces do matter, that the way your phone buzzes in your pocket makes you kind of want to see what it's doing right away, right? We have to exert effort to resist that. If it doesn't buzz, then we're not pulled to it, right? So affordances of technologies do matter. There is this middle ground, right, saying people matter a lot. The affordances of technologies do influence people. All right, so the research. My research is, sometimes I do quantitative research where I pretty much know what I'm looking for going in. But the kind of research that I really love doing is open-ended, which is to say I've got this topic, I know there's really interesting stuff going on there, but who knows what I'm going to find and what's going to be interesting about it when I get there. So there's a lot of benefits to open-ended qualitative research. You get this incredibly rich data, some of which I will share with you soon. You can get at, with interviewing, you can get at people's private perspectives in ways that are not observable, and people have told me amazing stories about things that they have experienced in response to emails, which would never be visible. A lot of challenges. How do you recruit people? And I think that if you're working with most people, they're like really psyched to be interviewed because they never get to talk. If you're working with, well, you want me to talk about myself for an hour? Where do I sign? When you're talking to musicians, and I imagine it's the same with politicians, they do interviews all the time. There's no personal thrill in being interviewed, right? It's not like, ooh, I get to talk. You know, yeah, I've got 18 interviews scheduled tomorrow. I can fit you between 1 and 110, maybe. Right? So recruiting people is a challenge. And I found that with this project, it was a challenge because often musicians don't want to talk about their relationship with their audience, right? They're more than happy to talk about the music, but this is a personal thing and it's a dangerous kind of a thing to talk about. Interviewing across distance, I couldn't fly around to interview everybody. I ended up using Skype. Skype was awesome. Skype worked really well. Video Skype worked incredibly well. And I used a, what is the darn thing called? I'm blanking right now. I can see its little microphone icon in my sidebar. No, it's not tape recorder. Anyway, there are multiple options of programs that will record what is on your computer at that time. Send them all off to get transcribed. Transcription is a bear. I ended up using a service. It's a gamble. It's a bargain between how much time do you have and how much money do you have? I decided time was worth more than money, and I sent it away. It's not cheap to have transcription done well. There are IRB-approved services out there. I use one called Production Transcripts, which I actually recommend. They're really fast. They're really high quality. They're not cheap, but they are IRB-approved, which is really nice, because if you are dealing with confidential data. I was concerned about this, because this is, you know, some of these people they're known. Right, and I could see somebody getting ooh, I'm a fan of theirs, ha 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 ha, right? I was concerned, but they did a great job. Okay, analysis. I've taught qualitative methods for a long time, and if you look at qualitative textbooks, they invariably have tons and tons and tons of stuff about how to get in and how to recruit subjects and how to avoid becoming one of them and maintain analytic distance yet relate to them. And then there'll be like maybe a chapter on analysis, maybe. So I wanted to spend some more time talking about analysis. the beauty of this kind of research is you get really deep understandings about meaning, which is very hard to get at with abstract data points, no matter how many of them you have. But there's a lot of challenges, and one of them is how do you go through this rigorously and avoid just sort of picking the compelling anecdotes that tell a good story? How do you maintain focus when you can be pulled in so many different directions? And how do you bring yourself to the point where you say, you know, this is incredibly interesting and I absolutely love it, but you know what? It doesn't fit in this project and I'm going to sacrifice it. Because I know that for students, this is often one of the hardest parts, is just letting some of your data not get used in your work. And it's okay to do that. It hurts. It hurts. It never stops hurting. But it doesn't go anywhere. If you want to return to it later, it still exists. So who did I interview? I'll just put these up for a minute. My focus was on people who had had an audience prior to MySpace, so they had actually been through the transition of not needing to relate to an audience to needing to relate to an audience online. You can see that I sought an international sampling. I also spoke to some who were part of what Sivert Høyem from Norway called the last generation of analog musicians, which I love. These were the people who got their audience just before MySpace happened. So they got together with no thoughts of social media, and suddenly there it was, and they had to deal with it early in their careers. And then I talked to a few young people as well who grew up on social media and who really took it for granted, which is a really interesting thing in and of itself. I spoke to one of these people and I said, do you ever think about what it would have been like to be a musician in the 80s when you didn't have to use social media and talk to your audience? And she's like, wait, you mean like you could just do your music? I never thought about that, she said. It's totally ingrained that this is a thing that's there that you have to do. And I think listening to Ines's talk about the sort of controlled, coordinated chaos around how do we use this, you see that legacy of people who don't take for granted that you have to do this and now feel that they've got to figure it out. A whole bunch of genres, mostly singer-songwriter indie, but I did manage to get a whole bunch of genres in there. Total of, I think, 37 musicians. Okay, so when you get to the analysis, here's the immediate problem. It's really rich. There's 850 pages of it, and just about every line is really, really interesting. All right? We talk about big data, and we say, oh, there's 30 million data points. Well, you know what? 850 pages of words of people talking, that's pretty big too, right? It may be 37 people, but it is a lot of data to try to make sense of. A lot of data. And then we've heard about a lot of different software. In vivo, Atlas TI. Man, I wish somebody would invent a really good qualitative analysis software, because those are not them. Right? They do some really nice things for us. They've got incredibly steep learning curves. Incredibly steep learning curves. I ended up using Deduce, which is also very limited, and I ran into some real problems with it, but I want to mention it to you because in vivo and Atlas TI are really, really expensive. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And if you are not working at a place that has a site license or not working with somebody who can afford to buy it for you, Deduce is a nice alternative. It's a cloud-based system. It's $11.95 a month. And if you don't pay in any given month, your stuff just sits there. And you can come back to it 3 months later and reactivate your account with $11.95, and there's all your data just waiting for you. So grad students I have worked with who were doing PhDs and who didn't have like $1,000 to lay out on in vivo really found Deduce very helpful. So it has its shortcomings. Me, I use Deduce, but I always seem to end up using the outline function of Word. It's so freaking simple, but for me, it really works. You can drag stuff, you can rearrange it, you can put subcategories, and I did it before I worked for Microsoft. All right, so what are my analytic strategies? I'm looking for themes. Everybody looks for themes, but this is what drives me crazy about a lot of qualitative research is you go, there are 7 themes, and you think you're done. No, you're not done. That's like saying, I've got a yard full of bricks, and thinking you have a house. Right? You don't. What you've got is the raw material. Well, maybe it's a processed material, right? But you still have to think about what does that tell you? How do those things fit together? What are the logics that allow you to see which bricks go where when, right? These are the really important questions. They're not what are all the pieces, but how do those pieces fit together into an organized system that makes sense to the people who do these things in their everyday practice. So one way to get at logics is to ask a lot of questions, and this is where theory comes in really helpful. As somebody who's interested in dialectics, I'm always looking at data going, what's playing off against what? What are the contrasts here? If you do this, what do you give up? If you do that, what do you give up? What are those if this, then that kind of balances that people are working through? How are people different? As a communication scholar who was raised with the idea that communication is a goal-oriented practical activity. I'm also always asking, what are people's goals and what strategies are they using to reach those goals? So it's important to have some kind of grounding in which you can ask some simple questions of your data beyond what are the categories of things people talk about. I'll show you an example of a matrix. Miles and Huberman have a book on qualitative data analysis where they talk about matrices in a lot of depth. Really useful strategy. Back to theory, and then writing. Let's not forget that writing is itself part of the interpretive process, right? If you, I think any qualitative scholar will tell you that they've had the experience of having analyzed their data and thinking they knew it and then sitting down to write and realizing that actually it didn't fit together like it was supposed to at all, right? Writing is part of how we figure it out, and sometimes drawing is too. So here in this project has been sort of my analytic process. And I'll show you some pictures of what these things look like. But I started by just reading a whole bunch of the transcripts, not every single one of them, but a bunch of them, and just making a list. Anytime somebody made a point or raised a topic, I put that in a list. And I ended up with 7 pages of single-spaced things people said. And then I grouped those into broad topics, yay, outline function. Generated a list of themes. This came up to, I think, 263 different themes. And then went back to the transcripts with a subcategory of those themes and started actually going through trying to do a real rigorous coding of every single transcript. And I did some kind of top-level coding, which is to say I would go through and say, this is about relationships, right? And code it as being about relationships. And then I would go through and say, take all the excerpts that had to do with relationships, which Deduce was very helpful for pulling out, as would have been in Vivo and Atlas TI, and saying, what are the sub-things going on within here? And this is where Deduce broke down for me. I was not able to pull up excerpts and then code excerpts. So I had to export all the excerpts and return to Microsoft Word with all its limitations. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's a highly iterative process, and this is part of doing open research, is that you don't know what your codes are going in. And as you're going through doing the coding, you start realizing, you know, this actually looks an awful lot like that. Maybe they're the same thing. Or this thing that I thought was a big thing, actually I got one example of that. I don't think it really is a big thing after all. So I wanted to give you a typical excerpt just to sort of give you a feel for the richness of this data. So this is Sivert Høyem, the Norwegian musician, who just so happens to be my very favorite singer. And he's talking about, you can see what he says. He says, some people pick up on everything I do, and they seem to think that it's all very significant. So they just get a little too much, I don't know. Yeah, there's been quite a few who have been a little scary. But also, sometimes, since you're really available to people all the time, if people want to get a hold of me, they can. So some people, you just start communicating with people, and they just kind of, it can take up a little bit of too much of your time because they write back all the time, and I don't want to be rude. So I say, yeah, so you feel compelled to keep responding? He says, yeah, and it can get a little too friendly. Okay, so if we take that, let me just ask you guys, what are some of the things that you hear going on? If you were making a list of all of the themes that you might hear in this data, what are some things that just right off, just in this little excerpt, strike you? Etiquette, okay, so etiquette, politeness, definitely.
Obligation.
Okay, a sense of obligation to respond. Yeah, where's the chalk? Okay. Okay, so etiquette. What was that about responding?
Obligation.
Obligation. Yeah, a sense of obligation.
Discomfort, boundaries.
Boundaries. Yeah, hello, boundaries.
Discomfort, scariness.
Scariness, discomfort. Yeah. Almost everybody I talked to had dealt with stalking. Almost everybody, in one way or another.
Time management.
Time management, absolutely.
Fan relationship.
Fan relationship, you said?
What kind of relationships you have with your family?
Yeah, so what kind of relationship you're willing to have with them? Absolutely.
The language which they use to refer to it, friendly, when clearly friendly is not what the relationship is. It's like how they refer to their fans and the.
Yeah, which I would sort of connect with relationship type, but absolutely, yeah. Okay, so we could probably spend like an hour, right? So here we have one paragraph and we've got 9 themes right there. Right? So you can imagine with 850 pages of this, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on there. I thought you'd come up with a bunch that I hadn't, but I think I got most of those in there. So I'll show you just sort of some screenshots. So initially I come up with this hierarchical list of topics. And this is before I've gone through and done the close analysis. If you look in there, accessibility is one, which you guys didn't just raise, but he says if people want to get hold of me, they can. Right? That has not always been the case. Right? In Fisher's, no, it's in Carolyn Marvin's great book, When Old Technologies Are New. They talk about people phoning the mayor of New York City all the time because they could. They didn't have anything to say. They were just totally psyched that they could. Some of these things don't show up in there, but this issue of writing back, these etiquette and obligation come out within there. Boundary violations, people write to artists, they socialize with them. This issue of are they fans or friends, which speaks to these 2 things that you guys mentioned, which ended up being a major, major component. I've got a paper coming out any day now in a journal called Participations that's called Fans or Friends. And inappropriate audience behavior, so things like having unrealistic expectations and misjudging the intimacy of the relationship. So you can see you hit on a number of things that I also found in here, which is important, right, because it speaks to the fact that this isn't just a crapshoot, right? There is, in fact, some analytic mechanics there, and other people can look at it and see. They might emphasize different things, but we can all see the same things going on there. These are just some sections. If you look at the top, this is the top levels when it was collapsed. This is the areas that I ended up with in my 7 pages. And you can see that those ended up being small, well, pieces of it, right? So personal musician-audience interaction, personal relationship dynamics, those I would mostly fell into here, but there's a lot of other stuff going on in there as well. Lots of other stuff. So then with these sort of lists of codes, these long, long lists of codes, then I go into deduce. Right? And I start actually doing coding. And this is an example of what comes out of deduce, in this case coding for family as a topic of discussion. Right? And I'll give you some more examples of this, but each one of these then is an excerpt that I coded from 3 different interviews in this case where people are discussing, talking about their family. So you have Stuart Braithwaite from Mogwai saying, I don't think anybody's particularly interested in our girlfriends or wives. I had a friend of mine who weren't more popular than us but has a different kind of audience, and they did get people saying weird stuff about their wives. Casey saying, I don't answer too many questions about my marriage. It's not something I want to discuss with fans. D.A. Wallach from Chester French, first banned on Facebook because they were students at Harvard when it launched. He says, I don't think it makes for interesting content, and you get into dicey territory when you're talking about your personal relationships, your family. So going through and doing all of this, and then you end up with these blocks of quotes, right? And sometimes I would excerpt the quotes. One of the things with working with digital materials is you think, oh, I've got it all under control. It's all nicely coded, and I'm going to put my 15-minute ICA talk together now. And then you print it out or pull it into a file of just those excerpts, and you realize you've got 80 pages, and there's no way that's going to be a 15-minute talk. So this is where I'm talking about sacrifice, right? Sometimes you have some beautiful, beautiful quotes that just nail it, but you know what? You have 6 other beautiful, beautiful quotes that also just nail it. And even though you love that one so much, this one fits the talk a little better, right? Or you use the beautiful quote from that person in another part, so you're going to stick with it. You want a diversity of people's voices in your papers, too. So after iterative coding, after going through again and again, these are some of the things that I ended up with. And you can't really see because I didn't really show you enough to see everything that I had in those earlier slides. But this is different. This is not what was in that 7-page outline. This is what it became afterwards, parts of what it became. So for example, the issue of what topics do you discuss became a pretty clear focus with a lot of very specific topics that you either do or don't discuss. Personal content, embarrassing body problems. One guy told me that his wife went off on him for telling his fans that he'd had a vasectomy on Twitter. Tangible aid, things that'll be interesting to the group, life in general, music, family, location, politics, things that aren't about me, having control over what topics you discuss. I would argue that all of those things, except probably music, apply to any public figure or any of us, really, discussing things on a public forum. We have to think strategically about what topics are we willing to discuss, what will we reveal, what will we keep back. Obviously, we've had a number of politicians get in trouble for things that they tweeted because they were not thinking very clearly about what are the topics that I should avoid in social media and what are the ones that get there. And we've got a system now where all public figures' tweets are being monitored very, very closely, right? So there is no free rein to tweet an offhand little joke about something. It will be on all of the political blogs tomorrow, and you will be apologizing if anyone was offended. Not to be confused with apologizing. Here's an example of a matrix. This matrix ended up, I think if you print it out, it's like 54 pages. And this, what I did here, and this is after a lot of going through, a lot of passes of the data. This is probably about 1.5 years into the analytic process. The idea of a matrix is to figure out how could you create an X and a Y axis that will allow you to do some interesting comparisons across your data. In this case, I chose to use the individuals as one axis. And across the others, I ended up using, boy, what did I use? This first column is encounters they have with fans in person. The second is what mediated contexts do they encounter audiences in. The third is what are their perspectives on social media. The fourth is how do they understand their communication through music and through performance. And then finally is what is their perspective on communication and relationships. And I went through and I pulled every single quote that talked to these things. And let me just add at this point also that I framed this study to the musicians as being about nobody knowing what to do with social media, kind of that pitch I gave you up front. But I asked a lot of questions that didn't have to do with social media so that I would be able to look at social media in the context of the full range of interactions that people have. I think a huge mistake people make is you're going to do an interview and you're only going to ask about Facebook or you're only going to ask about Twitter. And what do you know? 90% of what happens on Twitter happens in all kinds of other environments, including face-to-face interactions as well. But you think it's about Twitter because those were the blinders you were wearing. So I think it's really important to think broadly about the larger context within which these interactions happen. I boiled this down then to a summary. What are the main points? And the idea here is that it gives, what I started to see here was these questions of what do they think communication through music and performance is about? That's the key. That's the key that unlocks, I think, the whole logic of everything else that you see. If you think that music is about connecting with an audience and having a relationship, then social media is your friend. If you think music is about getting emotions you can't speak out, then you may or may not like social media, right? If you think music is about creating art that others can admire, then you probably don't like social media, right? So this philosophy of what are you doing by making music? And my guess is that this kind of logic probably holds across other areas as well. Why are you in public service, right? That probably affects what you think about social media. Because I'm smart enough to make decisions for everybody, or because I love to listen to what people have to say, right? You're going to get really different attitudes, I'm guessing, toward engaging your constituents through social media. So Matrix is a really useful process to help get you there. This is an example of drawing. I took a lot of art classes as a kid, but obviously I didn't learn that much. But I did learn a little perspective. So this is Goffman comes to social media via Nancy's dubious illustrative skills. And what I was trying to get at here was a set of really complex relationships among different factors. And the ways in which putting yourself on a stage, back to dramaturgy and impression management, and Goffman-esque sorts of perspectives on things. What I was trying to get at here is that you have a number of backstage relationships that contextualize what you are and are not allowed to do on that stage. You have a lot of different ways in which you can perform on that stage. And you have a lot of different audiences with semi-permeable boundaries that you're trying to speak to all simultaneously. So the individual in the middle, you have some kind of human being making music, right? They're connected to other musicians. That turns out to be a wildly important thing, is being able to connect to other musicians through social media, knowing you're being watched by them, being able to watch them. You have this network of personal relationships that's extremely important and really shapes what you can and can't do. You have this whole business machinery going on that's important. And then you have the sites and their policies, which shape what you can and can't do. The affordances of particular sites, extremely important. And then you have all these different places you can be. You can have your own website, you can be on Twitter, you can be on Facebook, you can be on MySpace, though why anybody would anymore remains a bit of a mystery. You can blog, there's fan forums, there's of course your music itself. And then you're performing for, and again, you can think about this much more broadly than just musicians, right? You have some of the people reading your feed are your family, they're your friends, they're people who know you really, really well. Some of them are colleagues, collaborators. Some of them are the diehards who love everything you do. But also, therefore, might be very critical of the things you do because they're so deeply engaged with it that they catch every little thing you do wrong. And then you have a broader audience. And then you have all these people who are kind of out there who maybe you'll be able to bring them in through your social media presence. Maybe you'll convert them into your community. So just an example of how drawing a picture really helped me to think through how do these components relate to one another? How does what's backstage relate to what's front stage? This, I mean, you can write this in prose, but drawing a picture actually was a really effective analytic strategy for me to get there. I don't often draw pictures, but I just want to mention it as a I mean, you've been talking about visualization a lot, right? It's a different kind of visualization, but it's the same kind of idea, right? Of what does this look like, and how can we use an image to help us gain insight into the meanings that are here? All right, so let me talk just a little bit about what has changed pulling from those an analytic process that an analytic process that I walked you through there. one thing that's clearly different is that people now have a responsibility for their own self-presentation in a way they didn't before, right? The media used to be in charge of that. The New York Times presented you. You didn't have to present yourself, or Rolling Stone did it, or New Musical Express, or whatever. So this is great in some ways. It's empowering. It raises anxieties, right? And I loved this quote because it really speaks to the anxieties, right? He says, as corrupt and horrible as the old recording industry was, at least it was stable. Right? At least we knew what we were getting. We were going to be taken advantage of, but we knew that, right? It wasn't changing constantly, and this constant change is really anxiety-provoking. One of the things that when I go to music industry events, I hear over and over again from musicians, they think they have to be on every single social media site. And they think they have to be personally using every single one of them. And if you say to them, you know what? It's okay not to tweet. They're like, oh, thank God. They need permission to not use all of these sites because they think they have to. There's this relentless pressure, you know. And you probably know people who feel like, oh no, I'm not on whatever. And they think they're really missing out. But in fact, you know, it's not a big deal. It's okay. This is Kristen Hirsch, who she's got a wonderful book called Rat Girl about her bipolarity. She talks about, she didn't bring up bipolar disorder on social media, but people started talking about it, and she decided she'd be willing to discuss it so nobody would say anything wrong, right? So she's got this ability now to speak for herself, to be her own voice about her disease, and not to let other people write about it for her in whatever accurate or inaccurate way, to be able to speak for yourself about your experience. This question of what are your stages going to be on which you can perform. The people I talked to, I think it was a total of, it was about 40 different sites where they have a presence of one sort or another across them. Nobody was on all 40, right? But picking which stages are the right stages for me to perform on or for my organization to perform on, these are huge questions. And again, it's not really clear. Like right now, everybody's all about Facebook, right? You got to have your Facebook page, but what was the figure we just heard of some enormous percentage of them where there's absolutely nothing going on there, right? You create the page because you have to, and then it dies. And that doesn't look very good either. So this issue of trying to manage the incredible amount of social media sites available and figure out which ones can I actually use effectively and which ones do I just forget about is a real problem for everybody, really. Privacy, as you saw just in that little excerpt with Sievert, is a really big concern. Erin McCune talks about Dana Boyd's college roommate, by the way, because she's everywhere. She talks about feeling the pressure to provide continuous, fresh, personal content and how this is at odds for her with what a private person she is and her wanting to have boundaries, but not have the appearance of having boundaries. Right? So some really tricky self-presentational work that's going on here as a public figure. You know me, you know the real me, you know all about me, but I also have this life that's for my friends and family, and you don't get access to that. But you don't see that you don't have access to that, because then you might feel excluded. It's really tricky, really tricky. I showed you the family excerpts, lots of social media activity being driven by concern for one's family in one way or another. And often, some people post their baby pictures, but a lot of them just keep their family out of the discussion. So David Lowery from Cracker and Camper Van Beethoven talked about it started really early on because his wife was so concerned about it. The kids are off limits. A lot of people keep their kids off limits. Zoe Keating, whose umlauts actually go after the E. Sorry, I didn't get that one fixed. She talks about, for her, it's really easy because she doesn't have to think, is this my indoor voice or outdoor voice? But she has to think about her family members, right? And not tweet about her family members, not post about her family members. Zoe, for a while on Twitter, was one of those when you started an account, you know, here's recommended people for you to follow. And they recommended her to everybody. And even though she is as you can see, a rather avant-garde looping solo cellist, not exactly the most popular genre out there, nonetheless, she has over 1 million Twitter followers and is actually an excellent, excellent tweeter. She posts pictures of her baby all the time, right? Cello toddler, as she calls him. He was cello baby, but then he grew a little. Now he's cello toddler. But her sisters, her parents, there she's gonna, you know, she's gonna ask their permission first. It will be interesting to watch at what point she stops posting about cello toddler without his consent. You know, cello teenager isn't necessarily going to fly. Really interesting one that I think is very applicable to politicians. If we think about the Kennedy legacy and we think about Wiener's Wiener. Lloyd Cole is an example of somebody for whom music is about making art that others should admire. And if you get too close, it doesn't work anymore. Right? So he really wants distance. He says, I love this quote, "The last shards of my mystique are in danger of being completely obliterated." Right? He knows he's self-supporting, he's not on a label, and he knows that in order to sell, he's got to form relationships with his audience, and he's got to go out to the merchandise table after the show, and he's got to shake hands, and he's got to have a personal relationship, but he also feels like that's in direct tension with his fans' ability to appreciate his music. Not everybody feels that way. A lot of people think that it's only going to enhance their ability to appreciate the music, but he feels like it's a threat, and for him that's a real danger. And again, I think this is a dynamic that plays out not just in music, but in all kinds of areas where I'm sure there've got to be a lot of and in fact, I've presented this work to people who study politics, and they go, yeah, this is exactly what our elected officials say. Right? I want them to know me, but if they know me too well, they might not respect me as a leader, so we need to have a bit of mystery about who I am for it to work. But on the other hand, you have somebody like Roger O'Donnell, who was in a little band you might have heard of called The Cure, and he talks about, yes, 5 minutes, yeah, I'm good. I'm almost at the end here. Yeah. He talks about liking to maintain mystique. This is my favorite example of a mystique-free tweet. Do we really want this from our pop stars? Context collapse is obviously a huge issue also, right? Can you talk to your family and friends on the same platform as talking to your audience? Facebook has now divided up. You have pages, but you also have personal pages. But it wasn't always that way, and a lot of people got stuck in the personal pages and had fans on there, and now they are stuck with this collapsed context. So people manage this by being strategic about their topics, right? I talk about the music. That's why they're there. If I tweeted everything that happened, it would destroy the magic. So knowing what to be absent, what to keep off, what to not share. We talk about TV and politics and other music, because if we're just talking about me, it's totally boring. And then people also keep quiet, right? They just don't say things. Some people opt out entirely. One woman I talked with had made the decision to leave social media. D.A. Wallach talks about it's important to both present and conceal information in order to create an entertaining experience, right? So balancing these needs to entertain and yet to have fun. Or you can just opt out, as I mentioned. I would rather practice my guitar than read the fine print on Facebook. Okay, so what do I take away from this? Theoretically, the affordances of sites really matter in sometimes very unexpected ways. For example, a huge thing that comes up is the reciprocity of Twitter versus Facebook, and how very important, rather the reciprocity of Facebook versus Twitter. And that creates really different appeals. Social media itself, it's not good or bad. It's deeply tied to practices that completely transcend social media. It requires constant negotiation. It's not like you just pick your strategy, you get your pyramid, and then you're good. You continuously have to rework it. And beware ahistoricism, right? Dramaturgy still works. What do you know? We don't need entirely new theories. Social networks still do a lot to describe what's out there. And regarding relational and economic practices, which I didn't end up talking about a lot, they're really deeply connected because all of these things I've been talking about play out directly and indirectly in do people buy your product? And then finally, I'll just say that there is no one right way to use social media, whatever the social media pyramid and the like say. What's really important, I think, is that people understand why am I using these media. Remember in 1996 where suddenly everybody had a URL on their billboard and they had no idea why. Right? Tide.com to talk about soap, we need to really, you need to really understand what do the different systems allow you to do and what don't they let you do, and how does that fit with the goals that you have. And you really need to understand what are your own boundaries, right? Whether you're as an organization or as an individual, you really need to know what am I willing to put up with and what aren't I. And this is a continuous process, right? They evolve over time, but you have, all of these things call for continuous reflection. And of course, the affordances of sites change all the time, which also leads to a need for continuous reflection. So I will leave it there. I'm sorry I ran a bit long.
Yeah, great. Thank you. While Lisa comes and sets up, we can take a couple of questions.
Yes.
Lisa, where'd you go?
Quick
Here.
clarification. These are musicians who maintain their own Twitter accounts and update on their own. They don't have a team or...
Some of them have, they all do their own stuff. Some of them also have like an official account that they don't manage, or they have management who will do it sometimes, but usually will mark when it's from team so-and-so instead of from them personally. None of them are like Britney Spears where they've outsourced it entirely. Yeah.
Are there questions? Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Do you see any differences between genres?
No. I thought I would and I didn't.
And extended, would you see sports or politicians to be different?
You would think you would, but I don't. You know, the more I look at it, the more I really think it comes down to what is your philosophy about what your work is.
Good.
Yeah.
What kind of, a lot of your work was doing interview-based.
Yes.
Did you kind of correspond that to particular tweets? Did you go and look at their kind of presence on Twitter and see, you know, is it matching up to their self-reflections? Did you use different tweets as elicitation in the interviews? Understanding that relationship between what's present and traceable online to the actual kind of reflections you get from the interviews and that index.
Yeah, not rigorously and not thoroughly, and that's why I don't put up there that I did participant observation as well. I have had a look at the accounts, and I've tracked, you know, where are their accounts and how many followers do they have and things like that. And there are some kind of interesting disjunctions there. That rapidly escalates into it when you think about that across them they're on 40 different platforms. And there's 40 of them, it escalates pretty rapidly into even more data than I could manage, which has already been a challenge. Yes?
Were they interested in your analytic process and seeing that at all? Or wanting to see?
A number of them are really interested in the results, but the process, no, they don't care about that.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.